Most of us know the frustration of a lingering cold. The fever breaks, the congestion clears, but a heavy, foggy exhaustion hangs around for a few extra days. You expect to bounce back, but your body demands just a little more time on the couch. Now imagine if that post-illness fatigue didn't just last a few extra days. Imagine if your body lacked the internal communication system required to tell your immune system that the fight was over. For someone living with adrenal insufficiency, the end of a virus is often just the beginning of a complex, unpredictable recovery phase.
That prolonged recovery is a daily reality for hundreds of thousands of people. An article published by My Adrenal Life recently detailed why recovery from illness takes so much longer for patients with adrenal insufficiency. The piece explains that returning to baseline is not simply a matter of resting. It is an active, energy-demanding biological process. When a person's body cannot produce its own cortisol, the entire mechanism of healing changes.
We are going to dissect the physiological mechanics of that delayed recovery. We need to look at how cortisol regulates inflammation, the historical context of adrenal treatments, and how patients are now using wearable technology to track these nonlinear recovery patterns. To understand why modern patients struggle with this, we should look back at how we first identified the function of the adrenal glands. It is a relatively recent discovery in the grand scope of medicine.
The foundational understanding of primary adrenal insufficiency dates back to 1855. Dr. Thomas Addison, a physician at Guy's Hospital in London, published a landmark monograph describing 11 patients suffering from an unusual and fatal clinical disorder. He noted general languor, remarkable feebleness of the heart's action, irritability of the stomach, and a peculiar change of color in the skin. Today, we call primary adrenal insufficiency Addison's disease in his honor. At the time, Addison observed that the disease involved the destruction of the suprarenal capsules, which we now know as the adrenal glands.
In 1855, receiving that diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. Patients generally passed away within a few years because the medical community had no way to replace the missing hormones. The landscape did not shift until the late 1940s with the synthesis of cortisone. That discovery transformed a fatal condition into a manageable chronic illness. But the word manageable can be highly misleading when we look at the daily reality of the treatment.
The discovery of cortisone was miraculous, but it also locked medical treatment into an imperfect paradigm. In a healthy individual, the adrenal glands produce between 5 and 10 milligrams of cortisol per square meter of body surface area every single day. But this production is not flat. It operates on a dynamic circadian rhythm, peaking in the early morning to help you wake up and dropping to a nadir at midnight. This standard medical treatment today still relies on oral hydrocortisone pills, usually taken 2 or 3 times a day to roughly mimic that curve. But taking a static dose of medication can never replicate the body's natural moment-to-moment microadjustments.
That gap between a dynamic biological system and a static pill becomes incredibly obvious when the body faces an infection. Let us break down the technical side of how a healthy body uses cortisol during an illness. Most people think of cortisol strictly as the stress hormone that causes anxiety or weight gain. They miss its primary function as an immune regulator.
Cortisol is central to the immune response. When a healthy person catches a virus, their autonomic nervous system signals the hypothalamus to release corticotropin-releasing hormone. That triggers the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. ACTH travels to the adrenal cortex, prompting a massive surge in cortisol production. This cascade is called the HPA axis. During the acute phase of an illness, that extra cortisol mobilizes immune cells to fight the pathogen. It also increases blood sugar to ensure the cells have enough energy to sustain the fight.
The crucial part of the process happens after the virus is defeated. The immune system generates pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha to destroy the invader. If those cytokines continue circulating unchecked after the threat is gone, they attack healthy tissue.
Cortisol acts as the brake pedal. It binds to glucocorticoid receptors in immune cells and shuts down the production of those inflammatory molecules. It turns off the inflammation.
That braking mechanism is exactly what is compromised in adrenal insufficiency. Patients with this condition do not have a functioning HPA axis to flood the body with cortisol and turn off the inflammation. When they get sick, their endocrinologists instruct them to stress dose, which usually means doubling or tripling their oral hydrocortisone pills. They take a larger static dose to mimic the illness response. But as the virus clears, they have to taper back down to their normal daily dose. Because this tapering relies on guessing what the body needs rather than a perfect biological feedback loop, the information often takes much longer to settle.
The patient is essentially trying to operate a manual transmission in a car that requires a highly advanced computer. They are guessing how much fuel to give the engine. If they taper their medication too quickly, the pro-inflammatory cytokines keep circulating. That explains the lingering sick feeling the My Adrenal Life article describes. The virus is gone, but the patient's body is still inflamed, achy, and heavy because the chemical signal to stop the immune response was not strong enough or timed correctly.
That manual override also leads directly to post-viral crashes. During recovery, the body still has elevated energy demands to repair tissues. Cortisol is required to maintain stable blood sugar and provide fuel to the cells. In a patient with adrenal insufficiency, their energy availability is highly unstable. They might wake up feeling slightly better, decide to do a load of laundry or run an errand, and quickly burn through the cortisol from their morning pill. Without an adrenal gland to sense that sudden drop and release more hormone, their blood sugar plummets. They hit a wall and crash, sometimes taking days to recover from that single exertion.
This raises a significant debate within the endocrinology community regarding the standard of care. If taking pills 2 or 3 times a day leaves patients vulnerable to these crashes and prolonged recoveries, there must be alternatives. Some researchers and patients advocate for a continuous subcutaneous hydrocortisone infusion. This involves using an insulin pump filled with liquid hydrocortisone, programmed to deliver microdoses of the hormone 24 hours a day to better replicate the natural circadian rhythm.
The pump therapy debate is fascinating. Clinical trials have shown that utilizing a pump can reconstitute the circadian variation of cortisol. The pump can automatically increase the dose at 3 a.m. so the patient wakes up with adequate hormone levels, which pills cannot do unless the patient sets an alarm in the middle of the night. Some studies show improved quality of life and more stable energy levels with the pump. However, other double-blind studies have shown no significant impact on overall health-related quality of life compared to standard pills. The Endocrine Society currently considers pump treatment more cumbersome than conventional treatment and reserves it only for patients who encounter major difficulties with standard regimens.
The resistance to the pump seems rooted in practicality rather than physiology. Wearing a medical device 24/7 brings its own set of complications, such as site infections or pump failures, which can trigger a life-threatening adrenal crisis. But the reliance on oral pills leaves patients in a very difficult position. They're told their blood tests look normal, but they still feel terrible for weeks after a mild illness. This disconnect often leads to well-meaning friends or colleagues telling them, "You should be better by now." That phrase carries a lot of weight.
It is a deeply isolating phrase. It assumes that recovery is linear and identical for everyone. When a patient with adrenal insufficiency hears that, it invalidates their physiological reality. Their timeline is not wrong, it is simply governed by a different set of biological rules. Because the medical system lacks a definitive biomarker to measure real-time cortisol activity in the tissues, patients have started turning to consumer technology to validate their experiences and manage their recoveries.
The use of wearables like the Oura Ring or the Apple Watch has become a vital tool for this community. These devices do not measure cortisol directly, but they measure the downstream effects of the autonomic nervous system. Heart rate variability, or HRV, is a prime example. HRV measures the variation in time between consecutive heartbeats. A high HRV indicates a relaxed, adaptable nervous system. A low HRV indicates the body is under physiological strain.
Patients use that HRV data to see what they cannot feel. During an illness, HRV drops significantly. For a healthy person, HRV usually rebounds shortly after the symptoms fade. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, their wearable data might show a suppressed HRV and an elevated resting heart rate for weeks after the infection clears. Sleep architecture often remains disrupted as well. Tracking these metrics allows patients to see objective evidence that their body is still recalibrating.
Having that objective data serves two purposes. It helps the patient avoid pushing themselves too hard, preventing the post-viral crash we discussed earlier. If they wake up feeling okay, but their resting heart rate is still 10 beats higher than their baseline, they know to rest. It also provides a psychological shield against the external pressure to perform. They can look at the data and know their prolonged exhaustion is not a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It is a measurable physiological state.
The My Adrenal Life article frames this perfectly as gentle empowerment. Tracking is not about controlling the body with rigid perfection. It is about understanding personal patterns. The experience of secondary or tertiary adrenal insufficiency adds another layer of complexity here. These patients often acquire the condition due to prolonged use of external steroids for other illnesses, which suppresses their HPA axis. When they taper off the steroids, their recovery is highly unpredictable. The symptoms of steroid withdrawal frequently overlap with true cortisol deficiency.
The overlap between withdrawal and deficiency makes the recovery timeline even more opaque. Add in comorbidities like autoimmune diseases or dysautonomia, and the recovery process becomes highly individualized. Gastrointestinal issues during an illness can prevent the oral hydrocortisone pills from absorbing properly in the first place, creating an immediate deficit. The central takeaway from the scientific literature and patient experiences is that the body is not failing. It is navigating healing with a manual system that requires more time and profound patience.
Healing is an energy-intensive process. When the body has to rely on external dosing, the gap between what the cells need and what is available in the bloodstream will inevitably cause delays. Recognizing the mechanics of the HPA axis, the anti-inflammatory role of cortisol, and the limitations of modern standard dosing takes the mystery out of the prolonged fatigue. It replaces confusion with biological context.
Understanding that biological context changes how we view chronic illness recovery entirely. The expectation of a rapid, linear bounce back is an illusion for anyone managing a compromised endocrine system. If you know someone who might find this perspective helpful, text them the link to this episode so they can understand the science behind their own recovery timeline.